Good evening, everyone. I'm Ellen Whitaker, and I welcome you on behalf of the Lee Historical Society to this first talk of 2026. We're pleased to have Dr. Robert Wespiser here tonight, who will tell us about Lee's 1928 deadly strep epidemic, its devastating impact on the town, and the wide sweeping public health improvements which were made following it. Bob is a Lee resident and retired primary care physician who currently serves as chair of the Lee Board of Health. We invite you to stay after his talk to meet with him and enjoy some refreshments. Tonight, homemade cookies, everyone. And please take home an application to become a member of our society. They're on the table over there. Bob, I turn it over to you.
Thank you, Ellen. Appreciate it. Yeah. Right here.
It'll be on in a second.
Okay. Well, welcome. Thank you for the introduction. Yeah, I have to just turn these down because of feedback. I wanted to thank Ellen and the Historical Society for asking me to do this. I also have to acknowledge the resources out there to do this kind of thing. Libraries everywhere have archives now, and the Lee Library is no exception. It's excellent. There are archives. The archives that I use are the Eagle for a little, even Time Magazine, the New England Journal of Medicine, the Lee, and then the Berkshire Gleaner, the Springfield Republican. They all go back, and there's way more than that too, but I wanted to at least acknowledge that. And then thanks to Ellen, not for first asking me, which I said yes and then sort of immediately dreaded my answer, but it was the right thing. This was really fun to do. And the Historical Society, for all that they do, which this project was a learning curve there, and there's a lot, so please sign up. It's very well done and intelligent group. I want to thank my wife Diane. She spent her life teaching and doing PowerPoint. She helped me with this. So any problems, please refer that to her. But just putting that together because I don't. But also reflections about in town. She is a biologist herself and had a lot to say and to bring in. And we had fun talking about it, and it was really good. And there's a small little part dedicated to the Italian in her, and I'll talk about that. So this may have an on-off. Okay, good. Yeah, so what happened in Lee, right? School's out June 30th. 20 people get sick, some sort of flu-like illness, and by another couple days, there's 60 people sick. On July 3rd, the first person died, Mary Barrett. She lived on Prospect Street, and she had a lot of other medical things, so they sort of thought, well, she's got all this comorbid illness, and that's why she died. But on July 4th, Edward Childs died. An interesting thing about his death is so many people were sick, they had trouble finding 6 people to be pallbearers for Edward Childs' funeral. Pretty dramatic when you think about it. And so by now, just imagine what was going on the people talking and what the town's kind of atmosphere was like. I love the descriptions, the clinical descriptions of the illness. It's what I did. It's the language of that has some descriptive pieces to it, but also the reader knows. And there are those in the room. I did greet Dr. Terry Weavers here, who much older than me, but he would know. He would just appreciate the language. So I put a lot of it in here. Rapid prostration. These people were getting sick and just took to their beds, couldn't move. Quick and high fever, painful throat and collapse, sore throat with a severe boring pain in the larynx. This accompanied by intense swelling, and this was striking to me. Acute total obstruction was the immediate cause of death in several cases. And I was going to have the audience do an exercise now where you practice what it might be like, or you experience what it might be like, where you'd put your hand on your mouth and then use your other hand to block your nostrils. Serious, and it's like, but they basically stop breathing with no real anesthesia or anything. Pretty striking and terrible death. Severe swelling of the neck, bull neck was described. And I just loved these terms that they use. Glary throat. Glary is a description for a kind of like silvery, whitish membrane that developing, but it was absent here. And they made several places, the doctors made a special point of saying it wasn't there. And then quinsy. I just love that. Quinsy is like a peritonsillar abscess, and that was absent. Surprised the heck out of the doctors, and I'm not quite sure why. Kids didn't really get very sick, hundreds of cases, and what did they do? Nursing care was outlined in several places as key, and that was basically it. They tried to sweat it out of people and prep them for colonoscopy style thing, diuresis, heat. And they did have rubber tubing that they could try and relieve the obstruction with. But the tube, because of that glary throat, the tubes kept falling out. And there's discussion around that, including a really well done article in the New England Journal. But as part of this, people yelled for help. And some of the help was local and some was from the state and the region. Dr. George Bigelow, he measured up, and he was a big part of not just the pandemic, because he came out with a team and actually said, no, this isn't the flu, this isn't water, this isn't the sewer, this is septic sore throat. And that happened on July 7th, so that's already like over a week since this whole thing began. So imagine that week of panic and not knowing, and really fear and terror, and just a lot going on. They did an epidemiological survey right away, and it was pretty clear that this was milk. And I'll talk a little bit more about how that might have occurred. The Lee Board of Health immediately, and I'll talk about some of the members, Dr. Bigelow insisted, and the Lee Board voted immediately that any current supply had to be destroyed, and any subsequent milk produced for distribution had to be pasteurized. And although that might sound like it makes sense, both some modern raw milk enthusiasm and the state of farming and dairy at the time meant that was controversial. Within 2 days, the number of new cases developing dropped just precipitously to 0 within 3 days, and the town was left with a lot of sick people. 4,000 residents, between 800 and 1,000 were sick with this illness. So imagine this prostrate, right? Can't walk, can't, especially if you were over 50, and just so sick. So right here, the Hyde School, this big marble school. It's of course summer, so the classrooms were empty. And I apologize for the picture. You can tell it's very old print, but there's some kind of interesting things. Hopefully you can see the pointer. My wife and I, Diane, we were looking at this picture just earlier tonight. Here's the flag in the classroom. This right here, there's a long rectangular thing. That's the chalkboard. Yeah. Look at these are like poster-like things, or windows. We thought they were windows. In fact, there's a window opening in for air. Then if you just take a second and look, this is put together fast. Look at this. You can just barely see it, but this cot here has that crossway wood kind of from an old army cot. This bed is low, this one's high. These are bunk beds, military-style metal bunk beds that were meant to stack on each other. So thrown together, they had a phone installed in the upstairs classroom. They had to add wiring for lights and for suction, and 150 nurses poured in from all over. Springfield, Worcester, Pittsfield. Just dramatic participation. About 1,000 cases, at least 48 deaths. Some references say 50. Once you knew it was the cows, which cow, how many, what farm, a team of voluntary veterinarians went out to inspect every cow. I wasn't able to figure out how many cows were in the area, but a lot. And so finally, they find, and the science of bacteriology was way ahead of treatment. They isolated, and I'll talk a little bit about a famous player in this piece of the story, but the specific streptococcal strain was found, and it was documented so carefully to be present, the same germ, throats, blood, milk supply, and this infected cow. It was a human pathogen. That's really important because there are bacteria everywhere, right? And there are strep germs, hundreds of different strains and species. But this was not a bovine. This was a human pathogen, a human germ that was living in and infected the cow, but only as partial accident. This was a bacteria that was just well done at causing disease in humans. This cow came from Maine. It was one of a group of 17 cows. Several months before, a man brought them to his farm. He didn't know, but at digging later, this a milker was sick. This happened here. A couple of his kids were sick. This all happened several weeks, and it's suspected, not proven, that that's how this udder got infected and then ended up. Now, how did milk from one cow get to involve 950 cases? A distributor pooled the milk. It was not kept as cold as milk is today. It's a perfect medium for bacteriologic growth. So the bacteria just went nuts in these vats. The milk was distributed and got everybody sick. Estimates of loss to the county in commerce, but especially the summer trade was really important then, and it was really affected badly by this. No one wanted to come to Lee. Kind of not surprising. And there's mention too of things like Great Barrington banned any soft drink from Lee to be served in their entity. New York City banned milk from all of the Berkshires, not just Lee. So that was a big deal too. It used to go down by train. To minimize panic throughout the articles, both Springfield and local, you could just feel the minimization of panic they were trying to accomplish with the headlines. Like on July 8th, just even a week and a half in, milk epidemic, turning the corner kind of thing. You could just see, and everybody would get that. You don't want, you want to think the best of it, especially when panic and when so much economic harm is ready to come. This is pretty interesting, and it didn't blow up all that well, but I'll read it quickly. Epidemic fails to affect the Italian populace. And talks a little bit here about the number of people who are getting sick, but very few Italians. And I wanted to ask the group, any ideas why that might be the case? They ate a lot of vegetables, maybe. I don't think so.
They didn't drink milk.
They didn't drink milk. Excellent. Why? They like cheese. They drank wine, figures, right? Those crazy Italians. Lactose, I mean, this is my guess, but I saw this in my work, and Diane said to me, have you ever seen me drink a whole glass of milk? Look at Italy here. 72% of Southern Italians are lactose intolerant. 50% of the Northern Italians. And then interesting, this is something I learned, African populations tend to be over 70 or over percent lactose intolerant. So versus population in Lee at this time was heavily Irish and Scottish, and very low numbers of lactose intolerance from Northern Europe. So that's probably part of it, is that there was an intolerance. They just didn't drink milk. So I don't know. It was just a kind of cool thing. And Ellen, thank you for that article. Perfect. So in my research, I mean, the Scolforos, the Bartinis, my wife's extended family, very few of those folks were mentioned either in, unfortunately, the death rolls, but also in the families so devastatingly affected. Some of the health professionals involved, Stratton, of course, famous name in physicianship in Lee. This was Junior, and his father was a doctor too, back into the middle 1800s. And then I have to interject my own personal experience with C.W. Stratton, or Jim Stratton, who was the third. And when he retired, they hired me, not necessarily for his replacement, those would be impossible shoes to fill, but to at least take up some of the slack. And for the first couple of weeks that I was here, he came down to the office and we'd go for a ride, or he'd show me something with the charts, or and later, as the next few years, I was lucky enough to help in his medical care. I was his doctor, but he was just kind of my tie back to this era, and I'll talk a little bit more about him and his role in a minute. But interestingly, there's a C.W. Stratton IV, too, who was a very influential professor of medicine. He was a physician at Vanderbilt in Tennessee, and he was a full professor of infectious disease. And I can't help but just wonder a little if some of the history and the story, the deep presence of this whole thing in the Stratton family, and might have influenced him toward being an expert. And one of the things he was expert on was strep. Dr. George Wickham, my wife's grandmother, talked of him and his house calls, delivering babies. He practiced here in Lee for a long time, like 40 years. He was very busy. Didn't have any kids, so I don't think, unless they're through brothers of his, if he's related to any of the Wickhams that are present in Lee now, I'm not sure. But very, very popular. His obituary was like a half a page.
I think they're
cousins. So that is, and I imagine that to be the case on some of the names. And later I have a list of quite a few Lee families who were affected by this 1928 epidemic. Dr. May Holmes is one of the favorites of mine in this story. She is a physician who was living in Worcester at the time, but she grew up in Lee. She went to Lee High School. She studied at Smith for 2 years and then got into medical school and went to medical school. The first physician, a woman physician in the U.S., started a medical school. I'm blocking on her name. Elizabeth Blackwell, actually, and just, I mean, I have heard about her for a long time. Not unimportantly, she went to medical school in Geneva, where Diane went to college, and is famous in the world of women's rights and advocacy, etc. So Blackwell, her sister and brother, started a medical school in New York City, and Dr. May Holmes went to that medical school at the same time that Dr. Blackwell was still teaching and alive. So this female physician actually knew the first one in the U.S. Kind of a big wow. And the role of women in this whole epidemic is striking, not just her. Dr. Holmes brought with her 2 infectious disease specialists from Worcester, and they came out here and they ran the Hyde Buildings Hospital, this emergency hospital thrown together at the last minute with all kinds of cots and various make-do efforts, and they stayed for several weeks to do this. Dr. Jean Black was part of that crew too. Dr. Holmes was the executive CEO, she was called the superintendent of a large hospital called Belmont Hill Hospital in Worcester. It was right on the hill, just above UMass, for those of you who might have been around where Shrewsbury Street and Route 9 kind of go down toward the lake, and UMass Medical is there too. She was the superintendent there, and for about 30 years, she was very influential and had a lot to do 10 years before this epidemic with the flu epidemic of 1918. And that's an important little tangent. When this all happened, townspeople, they thought it was the flu. 10 years before, there was a pandemic of flu. I mean, we heard about that in the medical circles in comparing the COVID pandemic, but they were used to that and thinking of influenza. Dr. Holmes somewhat made her name, at least partially, with her efforts around contagious diseases. In fact, the nickname for that hospital in Belmont Hill was the Hospital for Contagion. Kind of like not good advertising, but and say that, you know, come have your orthopedic procedure done there. I don't know. I have to get to one of my favorite parts of the story is Fanny Seth. And Johnny, could you just wave your hand? This is Johnny Chisholm. Fanny Seth is her grandmother, and Fanny Seth had son William, also kind of used the name Russell, who I was lucky enough to help take care of. He was one of my patients when I first moved to Lee. She was the chair of the Board of Health, and none of us are quite exactly sure if she had interest in medicine or she had done some maybe partial training. There was a relative who was a nurse, I think maybe her sister, Muriel. Her daughter. There might have been, there were some suspected connections, but another woman in the mix of this terrible epidemic, rising and just so right in the middle. And I'll tell you later or now that, well, I did tell you, the Board of Health, against some public, against farmers' opinions in many ways, dairy opinion, insisted upon that pasteurization order. Other health professionals involved. The Board of Health also had a couple of other people. Mooney is also a name not uncommon in this area. Nancy Ryan is mentioned on several articles for her tireless work. She was the town nurse, which was pretty important at that point for scarlet fever notifications, for GI bugs going around. They had some quarantine abilities to quarantine a house and to counsel. She was also the school nurse and is reported to have worked several days straight, taking care of, especially in that June 30th, first few days of July timeframe, caring for just so many people. Bart Bossidy was a famous name. I came across a picture of a Bossidy wedding, and there must have been 50 people, all Bossidys. And anyway, Bart Bossidy was an attorney at the time. He was also a judge. At the same time, he had an ad in the paper I kept coming up on for legal work, too. So there was no ban on him. I don't know how that would work, if he'd jump off the bench and defend his, anyway. But he was an important civic leader. He makes the list because he ran an emergency panel, an emergency. I'm blocking on the name, like an office in the town hall to answer questions, to issue press releases, to deal with some of the commerce-oriented pieces, to try and keep down some of the fear and the difficulty with how this was all playing out in Lee. So Bart Bossidy was really important. He also helped lead some of the efforts around making regulatory changes to encourage and insist upon pasteurization. Margaret Owens Kelly, we heard from, he saw the ad for this talk and got in touch with Ellen, and I wasn't able to talk to him, but he was able to supply at least small part of the story. Margaret Owens Kelly died. She was married to a principal that's still Kelly's funeral home. Her son was not planning on coming home after his the end of the spring semester, but he came home early. Then to help out. His mother ends up passing away, and he went right to work at Kelly's and ended up working for them for indefinite amount of time. I'm not sure, but quite a while. This is Kevin P. Kelly. He used to live in Lee. He lives in Florida now, and he's still alive. He's the one that got in touch through the Facebook, seeing the Facebook advertisement for this. Archie Blash, many of you may recognize that name. Quite a few of the Blash family. There was a kindred of quite a few. And Thomas Vania also worked really hard. There was a ambulance that got borrowed from, I think it was the Pittsfield Hospital. I tried to clarify that but couldn't. But they drove the ambulance around the clock. They took shifts. They were just, it was crazy. I mean, 1,000 people sick, although 48 died. There was a lot more people who were completely bedridden, back and forth to hospitals when they weren't completely full, back and forth from home to our makeshift emergency hospital. And they were mentioned in a couple of different references as being big participants. Charles Arment also drove people around, and he was mentioned prominently as a big helper. Whoops. I think I have to be closer. So this is getting back to Dr. May Holmes. I kind of mentioned a lot of this. Very important physician at the time, and really just dropped everything. She was on her way to vacation on that Sunday, I think, and got the call from the childhood friend changed her plans, recruited not only those 3 female docs, but a group of nurses trained at the Belmont Hospital and skilled in handling these patients with infectious disease. And imagine that. I mean, this was before, lots of protective equipment like masks and shields and all the things we saw get pictured during COVID, and no antibiotics if you got sick. So these nurses, hands-on, saving people's lives, were truly in a war zone, a kind of battle mentality with significant risk. And I didn't see or anything about any of them dying or getting sick even, but just a lot of mention how nursing care was key. Another friend of the Berkshires, she ended up vacationing and spending significant time here, is this physician, Rebecca Lansfield, not physician, PhD. She was a microbiologist, a bacteriologist, and she was involved with the efforts at identifying streptococcal strains. You might remember I said earlier they knew this was a human pathogen and not a bovine or cow pathogen. That's her work. This work also led to the finding of dozens and dozens of strep germs, and it really allowed for the isolation down to that single cow because they knew how to type the strains. The understanding of the bacteria was way ahead of any treatment schemes. Her work had led to the development of what they call antitoxins, which are really, in our world, would be an antibody. The body forms antibodies in defense against invaders, bacteria, toxins, viruses, etc. Out of her lab and her work, several antitoxins had been developed, but they were found pretty early in sick people here that they weren't working. But in any event, we still use the Lansfield grouping today. So yet another one of these prominent women playing an important role. This is a little more distant, but samples of this germ went back and forth. Dr. Bigelow, the Commissioner of Public Health, ended up fostering some further studies, and many went to Rockefeller University. These here are agar plates. Some of you may remember or been, exposed, benefited from some lab work maybe in a biology class, but those are all plates. And despite the presence of that terrible epidemic, she and colleagues spent some time in the Berkshires, as many did, not so much that summer. This is a picture of what she worked on, and this is Streptococcus. Strep means chain, cocci means circle. They tended to be linked like this, but in longer chains. And the important thing to see is this granular nature on the surface. You don't really need to remember this except for each bacterial strain has different chemistry to these. Many times they're carbohydrates or polysaccharides. Some of them they're proteins. But each strain has different characteristics, and that's how she found that out. Here's just more of an AI type picture showing the bigger lumps are M proteins, but each one had differences, and it's that science that's still so important today in figuring out how people are immune to things and where certain people are more susceptible to disease. Pasteurization seems pretty evident now, except, there's still some resistance to it and a little bit of some trending toward some popularity of raw milk. But what is it? It's not an added chemical. It's not boiling milk. It's not removing something healthy or but it's simply heating it to 160 degrees for 15 seconds. The FDA recommends turkey or chicken be cooked to 165. So our turkey at Thanksgiving is harmed more than the milk is by this. These machines were already pretty sophisticated, where a tube or a series of tubes were exposed to heat, and immediately after that tubing, often doubling back on itself like a radiator in a way, was cooled down with ice, with fans. They did have electricity. So that rapid heating and very quick cooling was all that was needed to prevent this disease and to prevent many other diseases. Right now, strep isn't as big a deal, but there's still E. coli found in milk, listeria, a couple other nasty germs, and still pretty important. The national trend was to pasteurize, but only in big cities. Why? Distributors. There was economy of scale, and it made it a lot easier. And then people would get used to it. They really liked the covers. These snap-on covers, and milk togs or pogs were famous for a while. This kind of like thing that would, and the machine that did that kind of came about from the minute the milk was bottled. These things were popped on, and they were much more secure than corks or rubber had just come out. There were all kinds of weird caps, screw caps, never really worked for milk. So people kind of got used to pasteurization because they liked the caps. But there was a lot of resistance and controversy, and I'll talk about that. One of the in Lee, very little of the milk was pasteurized. A meeting in Great Barrington sponsored by the selectmen on about July 20-something found that less than 20% of the milk in Great Barrington was pasteurized. The fight began around not pasteurization, though. Dairy folks did not want to even have to have a license or register. There was talk of a simple permit for smaller producers and a license with requirements to satisfy that license for larger suppliers of milk. But even that, permitting and licensure, was very unpopular, and I could just hear, I mean, with all of the stuff with COVID, but before that, our Tri-Town director is here with smoking regulations. I can remember when restaurants would come before the board and just screaming about, what do you mean I have to have a smoking section? And now none of us think twice. I mean, restaurants are smoke free. I mean, when you're traveling some places out of the country, and you or eating and the smell of cigarettes, it's so foreign now, and we have that just in our lifetimes, not that long. But that kind of resistance and difficulty is part of what makes public health related work challenging, but doesn't diminish its importance. Just to be permitted, people didn't like. This was a big deal then, bovine tuberculosis, a deadly disease, very difficult to treat, and could be tested for. So they didn't have antibiotics to treat it, but they could do a time test, right? And we all maybe have had ourselves or our kids get these little 4-pronged time tests as part of our entry into primary school, elementary school. That could be done to cows, and it was strongly recommended, but you couldn't insist upon it unless you knew who the cows were or who owned the cows, and then, of course, had them registered. Each cow then had to be labeled, etc. And that was that was a big hurdle for a lot of people. This bovine tuberculosis now, it's virtually gone in our country, but still exists as a small level pathogen in the developing world. Other bacterial illnesses, too many to count. So, Tri-Town Board of Health, the organization I've been lucky enough to be part of for quite a few years now. It came about, it's a fairly unique organization, and the reason is because of the impetus, the drive to accomplish it occurred when 48 people died and 1,000 were sick. In 1929, so the year after this epidemic, it was established to have two functions: inspection of dairies and milk testing. In fact, the lab was right here in the building where Zabian's is now, downtown. And there are interviews in the early 1930s of this first milk bacteriologist or tester. Now that testing is primarily for water, pools, beaches, the fresh water around, hot tubs, etc. But back then it was solely for inspection of dairies and milk testing. But that's where the Tri-Town Board of Health came from. And there was some controversy about it. It's right now Lenox, Lee, and Stockbridge. At that time, other towns wanted to join, but ended up doing things like hiring their own, like a milk inspector. So, and one milk inspector might be employed by many towns, and that varied. And we still see that today with things like Title V septic field inspections and food establishment inspections. Might have one person, or at various times would have somebody who's hired out by several towns. And so Pittsfield had their own big department. And there were organizations that came in and wanted to beat it for the whole county. In fact, that commissioner, Dr. Bigelow, he really wanted to see it be county-wide, because he looked at, and is quoted as saying this several meetings, he looked at the plight of the small town as being insurmountable. That economy of scale with trying to hire someone part-time, the dedication that a part-timer would have maybe less than a full-time department with their own education and equipment, etc. So didn't come to be. County government in Massachusetts, that's a different talk, not mine, has never been all that strong. In other states, though, the county commission and county government is where sheriffs exist and a lot of law enforcement, but also a lot of public health, including sponsorship, not so much anymore, but of hospitals and clinics, etc. So Massachusetts doesn't have as strong a county entity, and it didn't really come true, but Tri-Town did. And it remains a model, really. I see that, and we're lucky to have the leadership to keep this going. But it really allows us to have the strength of programming and leadership and presence to kind of pull off, in a way, a lot of really novel and forward-thinking things like smoking regulations. Now Tri-Town's one of the leaders around making sure store clerks are trained on how not to sell to kids. Leadership around COVID was prominent. Right now, there's a public health nursing entity through the Southern Berkshire Health Collaborative that's just so strong and wouldn't be able to happen. So in a lot of ways, this Tri-Town Board of Health has this epidemic to thank. Dr. Stratton was on this board forever. CW, his father, was on it, the junior. I don't know about the first, if he was, or even when the Board of Health started in the 1800s. But we know Fanny Seth was on it too. One of the things, I don't know if I've gotten to this yet or not. Yeah, I'll talk about it in a second. Well, I'll skip ahead to it. Under pressure, the Lee Board of Health rescinded the pasteurization order. And this was controversial. Dr. Bigelow, the state guy, he came out to argue this. And he was, quoted in the paper. He became vilified. This guy, Bart Bossidy, who was kind of, the mayor of Lee in a way, not officially, but he was pretty popular and a good spokesperson. He had run the Epidemic Commission office he spoke passionately in favor of Dr. Bigelow and his efforts, etc. But that was a very popular decision to not require pasteurization, but was controversial and is controversial now. They did, however, they had enough effect that although they rescinded the order, all of the dairies in Lee kept pasteurizing milk. So they didn't want to be told they had to, maybe, but once they knew of all these people who had just within a year died, 1,000 people sick, all of them pasteurized. It switched from only 20% in surrounding towns to way over 80%. The Berkshires kind of like, they drank the Kool-Aid, so to speak. So very interesting. But to back up a little bit, what were the other reasons why pasteurization was resisted? Several, and this surprised me. It was a way of life. You knew that cow, Joe down the street had 3 or 4 cows. You knew them. You knew the milker. They wouldn't give me bad milk. It's okay. It's safe. I know the name of the cow. It's a way of life. We're close to the land. We're all natural, we would think now, in a way. Pretty interesting. Expense, right? Transportation. One of the first dairies was called the Laurel Hill Dairy, 64 Laurel Street, before renumbering. So I couldn't figure out. It was a concrete building. The milking room, the milk processing room, was 12 feet by 12 feet. They put a pasteurizing machine, series of pipes and heat, in that room. And I don't know where it is. It's as you're heading towards Pittsfield. I think the even numbers are on the left-hand side. Maybe there was a farm or something. It wasn't Hylon. Hylon somehow missed bad press about this. None of their milkers, cows, or was implicated, and I really looked. Anyway, Laurel Hill Dairy was somewhere in there, maybe near where the state police is, or that neighborhood behind the view streets. But anyway, not sure where it was, but that prominent, and that owner put in the first pasteurization machine in Lee. There were others available in Pittsfield, but to drive, the roads weren't the way. 1928, these are bumpy, kind of like couldn't go 60 miles an hour on the bypass. So to bring the milk up and back was just not good. Expense, transportation. A loud call was this masking of filth. Another surprise for me. Dairies that considered themselves more upscale, more thoughtful, taken care of, better at hygiene, they said just allowing them to pasteurize their milk will mask the fact that their barn and their dairy and their floors is a mess. And that wouldn't be right. That hurts those of us who keep a pretty clean ship. That was fun, but prominently mentioned in the reasons why resistance was present on not just pasteurization, but permitting and licensure. Nutrition and taste. Several comments around the taste of milk, that's raw or unpasteurized at least has a bit of the cow. I mean, yeah. Nutrition and taste. Nutrition, even back then, only knew of a few vitamins, but it was going to affect the nutritional content and the health benefits of milk. And this, right, I can't help but see that again in some of the current trends with regard to the purported benefits of raw milk. Interesting. There is no significant, I mean, there are slight effects on some of the trace vitamins in milk, but not the big ones, not like A, D. And milk isn't necessarily a huge source of other vitamins. In fact, it's supplemented with vitamin D. It's only a small, unless you add it, but vitamin D, milk. Anyway, probably not as important as people not dying. Government overreach was key. I mean, even then, we hear it now, that sort of like, they'll be watching, they'll be, that all of that resistance, that kind of freer spirit, especially out here, was very prominent and talked about some of these meetings. The exception still exists. You can buy raw milk at a farm as far as the end of the driveway. And that's still the case, that people can, if they want, get raw milk. So a lot going on with that now. I wanted to bring up, I saw this just the other day, and I don't know, the print's awfully small, but this Instagram post, Jessica Murek is a doctorate in nutrition and health economics, I think. She put this up on her feed. A bill to lift the ban on transporting raw milk is back. This Interstate Milk Freedom Act is to make at a federal level it against the law to ban raw milk from going across state lines. That currently exists. There's a ban. You can't transport raw milk across state lines. And it's the case that the further you transport raw milk, the higher the chance. I mean, again, even at low temperatures, it's still a culture medium, still a problem. And just that sort of presence in the news, what your thoughts on this don't matter, but it's current. This is not far from the news. I did just another slide or two. I have some time for questions at the end too. But I scoured the obituaries from January 30th through the summer in the Gleaner and in the Springfield Republican, and pulled as many names as I could find, and then tried to tail some research into either my own, like, oh yeah, that's a Lee name, or where they might have lived, what street, etc. One very prominent death was this guy, William Benton. He and his father, and I think his father before that, were the presidents of Lee Savings Bank. Interestingly, William Benton was born to privilege, but never went to college. When his father stepped down relatively suddenly, he was brought out of his activities hunting and fishing to be president of Lee Bank. Interesting kind of path to get there. Not what I would have recommended if one of my kids wanted to be a savings bank president. But that was a big deal because it wasn't sparing people in positions of wealth or power or comfort. William McDermott, that is a common surname, and he's related to people who lived in West Stockbridge. Pfeiffer is, and I took care of a couple of Pfeiffers. There were They lived up off of Pease Terrace, not far from the Coach Consolati's homestead, way up on the end off of Laurel Street. And the woman, I took care of Brad and his mother. And his mother was next generation, well, only one generation from them. The Palmers, prominent family in Lee and Tyringham. James Wilson, West Park. The Robertson family on Greylock. Lyford, another name that's made it through. This Loring, many of us may know Loring's grandchilds are grandchild John, great-grandchild Jim, who was a policeman in town, married to Pam Loring, and Lisa Loring, who's a colleague. She's a radiologist at Berkshire Medical Center, probably right on the verge of retiring. But prominent family. The Naven, this person was a Naven. They owned a lot of land in the kind of like northeast corner of Lee by Greylock Street, East Street, and a big family. Also prominent in local politics in the middle of the 20th century. The Kellys I mentioned, the son, Mrs. Kelly died. I mentioned son Frank Kelly. I remember going to funerals of relatives of my wife, Bartini clan, and he being at the front door. He's passed now, but he would have been alive at the time of the pandemic, and these personal connections I just can't. Mannion, Ellen Mannion passed in this epidemic. Another common name in Eastleigh and Otis, even today. This guy Salvador Beach, he was listed and was a Civil War veteran, so he was pretty old when he passed. But I couldn't help just think, oh my goodness, here I'm researching this thing in 1928, and there's actually someone who fought in the Civil War who was affected by this disease in our town. So this Hyde was part of that Hyde family that lent their name to the building right next door. A couple more, Leroy Hubby. That one I have here because of Ella Sabin, this Mrs. Leroy Hubby, and the fact that husband and wife died. But Ella Sabin was related to, somehow, we're not exactly sure. I talked to Miss Chisholm a bit about this, but Sabin was Fanny Seff's maiden name. So these folks lived on Park Street, not far from the Seff homestead, right on St. James, yeah. So right there, just a block, very close. What tragedy, right? What tragedy right there. And then Fanny living just down the street, just a lot. Bissell is a name that's ancestor to the Bissell of Bissell's Furniture, and up on Fairview. They, I think, still live there now. I'm not sure if this Mooney is the one that is still present, but Keating is, and is a big name. Mary Johnson, married name Harrington. This, I mentioned coming in, seeing the Walkers as that part of their membership of the Historical Society. And these Walkers, though, are different than those Walkers. This Dawn Walker, married to Kelly, lives on High Street. Some of her kids are same age as my kids, but that's that family, and she died in the epidemic. Some of you may know some of these Walkers. There was a whole bunch of boys who had a whole bunch of boys. Bossidy's, prominent family, and somehow there's some Bossidy connection to the house I live in now on Orchard Street, and I couldn't quite sort that out, but that's a different project. He died. John C. Bossidy, was a doctor from out of town here visiting. He got it and died. Moran, another common name, Mrs. Mary F. Diamond. I don't know why I put there, except she was in the obituaries. A Hale, that's the same Hale farm that still exists in Tyringham, another Naven, and a Graham. I don't know, I'm sure. In fact, it's probably more likely if I asked who doesn't recognize any of those names, only a hand or two might come up if you're familiar with the area, versus asking who does recognize a name on that. There's a lot of them, and many of us, right, recognize more than one. Not in time. 2 months after this June and July catastrophe, Alexander Fleming noticed in his agar plate, right, that culture plate, that there was a zone of no growth on a plate contaminated with a mold. And that penicillium mold became penicillin. And he's quoted as saying, when I woke up, and I like this quote because of the date. It's so proximate to the June and July catastrophe in Lee. When I awoke on September 28th, I certainly didn't plan to revolutionize all of medicine by discovering the world's first antibiotic or bacteria killer, but I suppose that's exactly what I did. He continued to work on the project, couldn't mass produce it. A group in Oxford in England finally figured out how to do it, but it wasn't until really World War II that penicillin became active. There was one other antibiotic in the sulfa class that had some bacterial, and we still have sulfa drugs, right? Bactrim is often used today for urinary tract and other infections. But really, this was the key in terms of what lessons can we learn. Virtually none of these deaths would have occurred. People would have only missed a little, well, not school, this was summer, but just a little summer vacation. Sandy Beach was open, by the way, and closed for this summer, actually. I think it reopened sometime in August, but so much was closed that I didn't get to today. I did want to bring up one other area of treatment that was really puzzling, maybe interesting only to me, but others might click. And that was what worked. Morphine didn't work for the pain, caused agitation. I don't know why that was, but it was mentioned by Dr. Holmes, May Holmes, that woman from Worcester, that coal derivatives worked. And I said, what's a coal derivative? Well, as chemistry advanced, certain drugs became evident as being fever reducers. And maybe they were being used for rashes, and people's fever and pain were reduced. The precursors of Tylenol, or paracetamol in Europe, are coal derivatives, and they were matched right up against aspirin as really the only treatments for the grip or the flu. It was called the grip at times back then, and I saw a lot of that nomenclature. But coal tar derivatives, and it's actually Tylenol that was helpful with generous doses of brandy. So brandy and Tylenol, folks. If you get septic, sore throat, brandy and Tylenol, and avoid the glary throat part of it. So what are the lessons of this? Well, there are too many to count. It's hard to end with a big bang, except, penicillin, I think, statistically is by far the biggest and most important advance. But I can't help wearing a volunteer Board of Health hat to talk about the governance, right, and how important public health measures are. The fact that when public health entities do their job, there are no headlines. You don't wake up in the morning and say, thank God I don't have septic sore throat. Way to go, Tri-Town. Because public health and epidemiological, the CDC now, right? It's for better or worse, a lot in the paper about it and some of the struggles it's having now. National Institute of Health. When these entities do their job, people just plain old live. They go about their lives. And these scourges, I mean, this was a bad one, but so many others, right? And so the importance of that governance, the more local it can be, the better. But really, to me, one of the things in the language of the newspaper, in the language in the New England Journal, in the commentary in the national magazine, Time magazine, that was present about Lee, the caring of the community, the way that they worked all night, saw hundreds of patients, drove ambulance, did so much. That's what we do. And whether you consider the community to be just Lee or the statewide community with Dr. Bigelow and Dr. May Holmes coming out, the regional and national community where caring professionals so dedicated, like Rebecca Lansfield, whether it's the Board of Health person, Fanny Seff, just young woman trying to make her way, the doctors in town, the civic leaders, the farmers scrambling to make it right when they had to, and finally, assuming that. So much in this story, and I had a lot of fun doing it. Again, I want to thank Diane for the banter. We had a good time doing it, and Ellen and the Historical Society for asking me. I'd like to open it up to any questions. Charlie.
Dr. Wespiser, thank you very much for a very fascinating talk. And describing this tragedy of the past and the way the community came together to turn it around. I can't help but notice parallels between this epidemic or this disaster and the avian flu. And I wonder if you think that that there are parallels and what they might be and how they might emphasize, again, the importance of pasteurization and all of the other lessons that you just mentioned.
Yeah, I honestly, I don't know a ton about the avian flu. Just for the crowd, it sounds like a bird, right, avian, but it is known to affect cattle of many types, but we're especially fearful about cows, and it's been found in cows. There have been still, though, Charlie, only a handful of human cases in the U.S., maybe a couple dozen. I haven't looked it up recently, but the role is similar. And I think, although there were some misses here, only noted by retrospect, right? No pasteurization, needed to really muster a reaction. Right now, there's very aggressive surveillance about avian flu, and I think the parallel is real, but but some of the answer as a lesson is already being applied. Surveillance. I don't have a lot more to say about it because I just really don't know the recent numbers, but yeah, avian flu. Other stuff. Dave.
I think I understood that the cow got sick from the workers that were milking it. So it really started with the workers passing it on to the cow that passed it on to everybody else.
Yes, that's suspected. Never, there was never a culture of the milker because the milker was better. His kids, 2 kids, were sick, reported to have been sick, but they were better. They were culture negative. Well, I don't know about if they cultured the kids, but that milker was negative. But it is a human pathogen, so in likelihood, started with the milker, got to the cow. It lived in the cow's udder and set up shop to reproduce and to make more germs, and then they got into the milk supply. Pansy the cow. Arthur, not Stringer. I forgot the.
No, in a foothouse in the corner. Rogers, yeah.
Rogers. That was.
The family.
Yeah, where was that farm? I couldn't find that. Frank Rogers, Arthur Rogers was the farmer who owned Pansy the cow, who.
On the corner of East and Maple Street.
East and Maple. So that's where the foot.
No, it's right next to the brook.
Right next to the brook, up by East and Maple.
It's now owned by Kalish.
Okay.
But his mother used to take milk to the pasteurizing place.
Yeah, my mother used to take the canned milk to the dairy on Laurel Street. It was halfway up the hill on the left-hand side.
Kind of by where the state police barracks were.
Yeah, a little bit south of the state.
Okay. So that's where the Laurel Hill Dairy was. And thank you. Should have asked you. Other questions?
Laurel Hill Dairy, where Lexington Manor Apartments is.
Okay, thank you.
Yes.
Thank you.
Whole stretch of land to the back.
Okay, so cool.
We still found milk bottles when you dig in the garden.
I knew it was up there somewhere, but by way of renumbering, right, I couldn't pick it on the map, and I looked for anyway. But you run out of time, too, for this. But thank you. That's so good. And that was the first pasteurization entity in town. Fast, too, within weeks. They must have called contractors and, gotten this thing plumbed up in no time. So good. Other questions? Or in the back? Yeah, so that's a really good question. The question was what percentage were person to person and what percentage was milk to person. There's no exact data on that, although I looked, and it was talked about in one of 3 articles regarding this epidemic in the New England Journal. It seems as if person to person was rare. There are a couple of reports, and it'd say, may have caught it from their cousin. You'd see that in the newspaper. But keep in mind, the surveying of this was door to door. Phones were present in town, but rare, but unlikely, not that common. And there was no, easy way to epidemiologically study the group. But it looks like rare person to person, vast majority was via milk. And another point of evidence toward that is the dramatic drop in new cases upon the institution of destroying tainted milk, but also pasteurization. Boom, no more new cases. So you'd expect a more gradual tail on the occurrence rate if person to person was a substantial portion of the contagiousness. So good question.
Those 100 nurses weren't dying.
Nurses weren't dying, yeah. They're just tough. Other questions?
I'm just struck with how rapid the response was. I didn't expect it to be that fast, and especially from the state. And I'm wondering, were there ways of defining epidemic so that quickly became the reason why there was all this concentrated help?
Yeah, so brings up the striking nature of the speed of the response. And I mentioned it in 1918. The influenza epidemic really gave a lot of an infusion of interest into public health and infrastructure around it. I think the reason why it got such swift statewide response was because of a really heads-up the state representative or employee of the state public health commission in Pittsfield found out very quickly, and he called. Bigelow was out here on Tuesday night. He left and came back on Saturday. So, and I credit him with that response. He had also helped with the 1911 epidemic of the same germ in Boston. So he had some experience 20 years earlier. Interestingly, there was a lot, I can only picture the buzz on the street of around this, and the dairies and the workers and the farm owners. The Rotary, the Tri-Town, it wasn't Tri-Town then, the Lee Rotary Club sponsored a forum and had the Commissioner of Public Health, Dr. Bigelow, and the Commissioner of Agriculture out for a debate, in a way, a talk, and both presented their sides, and that's when it got a little heated toward Bigelow, because he had brought up at that time some disappointment in the Lee Board of Health rescinding, despite the fact that every player in Lee still played the pasteurization game. But that was pretty interesting, this sort of tension between agriculture and public health. And there's still, I mean, we all have different skin in a game. And it's important in the measure of success in some ways, or failure or challenge, is that it wasn't until 1939 that pasteurization became a regulation in Massachusetts. We weren't the first state to do it. I think Michigan was. And they still were arguing for years, really, about not just pasteurization, but even just to license or to permit cows, to keep track. And I think that would come up again today. I mean, there's this sort of libertarian spirit that many of us have that's to be honored and talked about. The balance between that and legislating things that are good for all, is a tension that has the answer yes, not one way or the other, but both in measure. Way in the back.
Talked about when you talked about the Tri-Town Board of Health, you talked about how other towns had milk boards, but we also had a milk board. Can you talk about what role the lead milk board? I know James O'Brien was, I think, the chair at some point of that. Might have had in any of that.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I know that after 1929, Tri-Town was the milk board. Before that, there was a milk board, but I couldn't find any action or activity in the midst of this time frame around the pandemic. It was the Board of Health, Lee's Board of Health, and pretty quickly Tri-Town with its both inspection and milk testing functions. But I mean, there may be more to come. I didn't see evidence of them as a player at the time.
I take that back. I just checked my phone again. He was on the state milk board from Lee.
It was what?
He was on the state milk board.
Okay. Yeah, I didn't see anything about that. I wonder if that was more like they produced the commercials for drink milk with a mustache. I think they might have been a commercial forwarding, I don't know, but I just made that up. But I didn't hear anything about them, quite honestly.
I just wanted to mention after World
One or two more.
War II and how the chemical companies were coming up with answers to problems. And of course, with the dairy farm, I remember in the 50s trying to help my father and my uncle keep the flies away. I was going around spraying, probably DDT, I don't know. And it's mind-boggling now to think of what the farmers were given to help with flies and issues like that, and how no one realized, or few people realized, what was actually happening. I mean, because I remember spraying that fly spray so that flies wouldn't be flicking their tails and moving around.
Good point. One more question if there's one, and then I'll be around for a bit for people to come up. Jim?
Not so much a question, but more of a statement. I believe the gentleman in the back asking about the milk board.
Yeah.
When Triton created the regional milk laboratory, we used to submit sampling results to the state milk board. We have some archives at the office with the state milk board letterhead on parchment paper.
Very good.
I'm not sure, but my gut feeling thinks that we used to submit to the state milk board.
Yeah, they may have been a really good organization, but was overwhelmed. I mean, they're not used to dealing with death. Mary Lou, I cut you off, but my neighbor gets the last question.
When you talked about the milk being pooled, did that just happen on each individual farm, or did all of the small farms in town?
No, both. I mean, there were big containers, truck-borne, big, stainless and others. But yeah, no, it was all poured in, and I don't know the logistics of that, but that was the only way this could happen. All right, thank you, everybody.